Nope, that's not the link. How come it's showing up like that? Here we go. Hi, this is episode 6. We're going to talk about reverse racism, white privilege, and why they exist and why it matters. And so it ties into our previous episode where we looked at racism. So during that one, we definitely dove into the semantics of it. What does it actually mean? And I also looked at prejudice and how does that tie into racism and how can we separate those two, or are they conjoined? And so obviously we were able to get our definitions on it, how we see how they're applicable to today. And, we're able to wrap up and move forward into how we think those conversations can and hopefully will be shaped going forward to kind of make sure that we continue to work on bridging the gaps between races and, work past racism. With today, we're going to take a look at the flip side, speak a little bit about reverse racism. What does that mean? How does that tie into white privilege? And look to try to deconstruct those type of topics. The main case here, we're going to just have Tymon's piece. Price will have his piece. I'll hop in a bit as well, and then we'll just keep it flowing. So again, nothing more than that to say. Timon, I'll go ahead and kick it off to you. And just go ahead and give us your spiel, and then Price will go ahead and head off to you after that, and we'll keep it moving.
All right. So I feel like there's a bunch of different terms that just become almost just noise over time, just because they start getting used to mean everything and nothing at the same time. Like that's why we wanted to define prejudice. That's why we wanted to define racism. We wanted to eliminate sort of the ambiguity and make sure that if you're using it, even if you don't all agree on a definition, you're using it with intent and you know what it means. So in the same vein, we don't want to beat like this thing to death. We don't want to go over it over and over again and make this show all about definitions, but I know that there's already so much disagreement within my intimate social circle about what white privilege is, what racism is, what reverse racism is, if it's even a real thing, which I will tell you why I don't believe that it's a thing the way people normally define it in a second. But the reason that we want to do this is because when you start to give terms names and then you start to sling those names at the other group, all you do is perpetuate the vicious cycle of name calling and hate and disagreeing. But it's about semantics. And if it's not about semantics, it's about a deeper rooted issue. And so when you make it about semantics, then you either can't get to the issue or you're just using it as a way to not have the discussion. So, arguing if something is reverse racist or not, like, let's get past the terms first and foremost. And that's what we're going to use this episode for. And then let's actually focus on the real issues at hand here. So we've said this a lot in episodes prior, and I'll say it now. Always focus on the message. So the message is obviously of discourse between races. And, white privilege I think is something that's a little bit more established for people at this point. To me, that's a form of privilege. There's many forms of privilege. If you're a male in America, you have certain privileges. If you are wealthy, you have other privileges. If you're able-bodied, you have privileges. Privilege is essentially a circumstance where you have a competitive advantage over other people in a certain situation based on something that you inherited, such as genetics or economic status or whatever it is. It basically means that you didn't work hard. You did not necessarily work hard, because I want to make sure that people understand that when we say that there's white privilege at play, it doesn't just completely demean all of your accomplishments and they don't mean anything, because you still have to compete against hundreds of millions of Americans for everything that you get. So there's still a competition. It's still to your merit that you accomplish things. But if you look at everyone in America, and especially if you look at everyone in the world, you'll find that we all, especially if you're, middle class, college educated, 2-parent households, stuff like that, you had privilege. You had competitive advantages. And it's pretty undeniable that being white in America gives you many competitive advantages. This doesn't need to be a history of racism in America, but being white has always gotten you at least the benefit of doubt as compared to other races of people in America. And, you know, it's everything from getting the benefit of doubt to police officers not pulling out their gun on you, to getting the benefit of doubt in a job interview, to, you know, just there's a lot of benefits to being white. And that's what we're calling white privilege. So it's not an insult. We're not saying that you're not a good person because you are, if you're capitalizing on a privilege. I capitalize on my own privilege. I was always extremely naturally smart. I didn't really have to study ever in school. Like now it's coming to haunt me as I, you know, have to study for the GMAT, and it's actually hard. And I'm like, shit, how do you like study stuff? What are index cards for? Like, it's really hard for me to get back in the habit of studying. And it's because I had rested on a sort of privilege in a way. Like, natural intelligence was a genetic privilege for me. So that's an example of a way that me as a Black man, I don't have privilege when it comes to my race. I have privilege when it comes to, you know, just like what I inherited. And acknowledging that and being aware of it has been a problem for me at times. When I was a kid, I had no patience for the other kids in my class who weren't that way, who actually needed to study and who needed time to figure things out that I didn't need. And I was really impatient and I was really insensitive to them, and I was pretty much mean. I disrupted the classes, all this stuff. And all of that, if I had been aware of the fact that I had a gift, I wouldn't have been that way, or so I think. So that's what we're trying to say, be aware of privilege. Is a way of saying be understanding of the people who don't have it and how it might not be as easy for you. And I don't want to ramble too long, so I'll just get into reverse racism real quick. But this concept of reverse racism is basically, it comes up a lot. And this one, I think, comes up a lot with even people who are not conservatives. I think this comes up with a lot of white people, and they've expressed it to me. And, you know, I've heard there's always the fanning the flames on Facebook, one person says racism, the other person says reverse racism, and it just goes nowhere. But this concept of reverse racism is like, is the animosity coming from Black people at this point, or just minority classes at this point, versus, you know, the majority classes perpetuating the hate? Where is it coming from? The short answer is it doesn't matter where it's coming from, but it's bouncing back and forth like Pong. You know, like if you were treated poorly by someone, you're gonna have animosity towards them. When your entire family has been treated poorly for hundreds of years by a class of people who you don't feel like have ever shown any contrition or remorse for the way you were treated as a whole. I know that there are a lot of sympathetic people out there who have shown that contrition, but on a large scale, there's a lot of Black people who are feeling hurt and upset about the fact that a lot of white people don't seem to care, or a lot of white people don't seem to understand just how hard it is to gain equal footing in America. And so the result of that is that animosity building up, especially if they don't have a network that's of mixed races. Like, you go to areas in, you know, urban cities where there's not a lot of white people, they don't have compassionate white people to show them the sort of empathy and compassion that they need. You know, all they see is social media comments and Fox News and all this stuff. So that animosity builds up. And if that results in hostility towards white people, what did you expect to happen? And that's my point. And that's why I say reverse racism is a bullshit term, because it's not racism the same way that racism is racism. It's not saying that this is one group of people who is establishing superiority and backing that within a system like the United States government and the economy. That's not what reverse racism is. So to call it reverse racism kind of puts it on the same level as racism, when it's really not. It's a byproduct of racism itself. And so to say it's reverse racism makes it sound like it's originating from Black people, but that's just ignorant to the history of this country. The animosity in America was one direction for the most part. And that's why I kind of resent the term reverse racism, and I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, Price, is your opening statements.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I agree, especially with the ending. The reverse racism thing is kind of horseshit. I mean, look, this is going to be an interesting episode because this is a conversation that people have a hard time having because it's hard for people to separate the content from the emotions of it. We hit on this a little bit last time, and if you haven't watched the last episode, take a peek at that. Usually these things don't go in order, but this is going to build off a lot of the things that we talked about in our last get together. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that you have to separate, the content from the emotion, right? The initial reaction is we have to talk about the system and the structure and not the individual. We have to go after the foundations and the history and the reasons and not attack the people. And the corollary to that is white people have to be hip to the fact that we're not attacking you as an individual. We're not talking about saying you are a racist, right? But in mentioning things that are being done or being said or happening that have in very obvious racial bias, you have to have a little bit more. I was reading something today, and the author coined it racial stamina, to be able to not just sort of recoil and cry reverse racism and squash the dialogue, right? Because the moment you do that, all the progress goes away, right? And you don't give a shit because that doesn't affect you, right? Because this country is built exclusively to serve straight white Christian men, right? And if you're a straight white Christian guy, you won the lottery, basically, right? And you're set. Now, Tommy makes a lot of good points. This is not an indictment on like you being a shitty person, right? That's like that's like chastising LeBron James for being physically superior to literally everyone else. It's not his fault, right? And he can capitalize on that, and he has, and good for him. In the same way that like tall people are dope and fast people and other things, right? We're not saying that you should be apologetic about it, but it is your job to understand the position that it puts you in and understand how that works within society. Look, and we'll get into all this later, and I'll kick it to Willie, but I just think that the main thing that we need to understand is that dissection of the content from the individual, right? And understanding that, racism and being a good person, right? These things are not mutually exclusive, and how we navigate that territory of how you can define racism in a way that almost protects a lot of this bullshit that's going on, because I'm not a racist, because racism is purposeful maliciousness towards black people. So as long as I don't do that, and as long as I have black friends and don't say nigger all the time, then racism doesn't exist in my world, and I'm okay with turning a blind eye to that. I think it's time to, at least the very first step is just being able to understand and to say, look, I'm a straight white guy in America. Like, I had a head start, and one of the biggest things that this maps to, and which I hope we at least touch on and might have to have a whole other episode on, but is the whole thing about affirmative action and how now people are whining and bitching up and down the map, right, about reverse racism and affirmative action, and started obviously, there's a lot of interesting quotes from like Lyndon Johnson and guys in the 60s who are basically saying, look, you can't just have folks who were like literally fucking farming your corn a couple of years ago and be like, okay, good, go make yourselves, go be somebody, right? And that's like all this stupid shit that I got all wound up today about this Autry Pruitt guy who's like, hey, black folks, just go start a business and go to the moon and reinvent fire and all this other shit. Like, it's real easy. Look at all these white folks doing it. Just go off and do it. There's this weird mindset that we are all.
Tom's face just got real serious when you brought that up.
I'm so mad. Like, where are they going to get the loans from? Because banks have been redlining African American communities since banks existed. So where are they going to get the loans from? But yeah.
Well, and there's all kind of shit like that, right? Yeah. But there's a pervasive mindset, right, that we're all on a level playing field, right? And that membership is not important. Look, the facts are the facts. Membership is important. I'm not saying apologize for it, but you have to understand that that's important, and it's time to start, being a little more awake as to what's happening. So long story short, separate the emotion from it, be able to have this dialogue. Don't take it as a personal attack, and we're going to start that. That's what we're going to do. We're going to put this all out there, and our expectation is not for you to just eat it, right? But it's for you to have a dialogue with us and to say, okay, how do you feel about this? What do you think about that? And this is where shit like this starts. It's not always going to be comfortable, but it's sort of, it's like a colonoscopy, it's just something you just got to do it, and they're not comfortable, but you just got to do it. Willie's had one, so he knows exactly what that's all about.
Come on, man. Let's pass on that.
All right, so I'm gonna say that necessarily my views differ drastically from y'all's, but I think I want to start posing some questions. Okay. I'll frame my conversation first, then I'll pose some questions. So based off of, again, my own personal definition on racism, right? My personal definition based off the last episode was taking a look at intent and being malicious against, having a feeling of your race being superior than somebody else's. So I opened the spectrum. I opened the spectrum for not just being the majority putting their race above the minorities, right? So I had it where it could be it's not a one-way street. After having our conversation, doing a little bit more of my, my own reading, it's one of those things now where if that is your definition, then I think the term reverse racism doesn't fit because racism will be racism. If you take the more textbook, not necessarily if textbook's the right phrase, if you take the more a bigger view on racism where now it's going to be institutionalized, then it will be a one-way street, right? And I think when you look at it as a one-way street, I think it becomes a little bit more, I'm not saying necessarily difficult. I think it does become a more difficult conversation to have because then that conversation turns to somebody possibly feeling ostracized. And so this is, I think, the difficult one to be able to have is saying that if you look at it from an institutional standpoint, which makes a lot of sense, right? That racism is going to be institutionalized. We talk about institutional racism a lot in terms of institutional racism, a lot in terms of Black people and how those institutions, whether it's government, economics, whatnot, have again kind of put African Americans, Black people at a disadvantage. If you look at it from that sense, then yes, it will be one way. And when you start building your argument on that, then it's going to be kind of hard for somebody in the minority and quote not empowered to be racist. They can be prejudiced, but not necessarily racist. But again, that's when we start getting to the semantics of how you define racism. I think the biggest thing for me is not necessarily the definition of racism, but I think is going to be more on that privilege part. And you people have heard this saying, a lot of truth is said in jest. And I think comics do a very good job of bringing a touch of humor to very serious subjects. And every time this is brought up, I always go back to Chris Rock's stand-up. I think it was Bigger and Blacker. And he was talking about, how no white person in America would trade places with him. And he's rich. he's like, he's like, no white person would trade places with me in America. And he's rich. He's like, being white is like, always having $1 in your pocket, and being Black is always being 50 cents short. Which again is kind of an interesting way to be able to look at it, right? And I think it does make a lot of sense that there is going to be a privilege there, just based on the fact that you are a majority. It's not saying that you feel guilty about it. You just got to be able to recognize it. Just like when I step on, for lack of a better analogy, if I'm the only Black guy that steps onto a basketball court with a bunch of white people and we're playing 5-on-5, chances are, even though I'm short, I still might be a top 2 pick, right? It's just one of those things where you just kind of recognize that there's going to be a privilege that's going to be around you. Tommy spoke on it academically, Price spoke on it with LeBron and those talent athletes. It's just not necessarily feeling guilty about it, but recognizing that there is going to be a privilege attached to your status in America, right? As a white person, things are going to be a little bit different for you, and not necessarily easier, but is what you won't have as much of an obstacle. It's against it's easier than some Black people will be able to see. So
here's the thing. I think this gets me to my core point for the whole episode. People need to stop being so defensive, because that's what this all comes from. Like, it's hard to not be defensive. Your ego is tied up in it. Sometimes your safety is tied up in it, your reputation, like your family name. Like if someone's like, you got all this shit for being white, and you're like, my family it came through Ellis Island and lived in like a tenement in Brooklyn and struggled to get this, and like we had siblings just die off from disease. Like, don't tell me I didn't earn it. It's like you're coming from a place of defensiveness. It's like you're trying to tell me that I don't deserve all the things that I have. You're trying to take my accomplishments away from me. You're trying to insult my family. And on the other end, it's like someone tries to relate to you, And like if I'm a black man and like a white person tries to relate to me, there's times where I feel myself, you know, being like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like you don't know how it feels to be me. They're not willing to necessarily accept the compassion and the understanding that's out there, or they don't necessarily have the patience for learning about it and opening themselves up too. And it's generally about keeping your guard up. Like when any animal in the animal kingdom gets cornered, what does it do? It attacks. It starts being hostile. It starts being really defensive. And I think in that analogy, like black people are cornered, and not all of us feel the same level of danger, but there are black people who feel very threatened on a daily basis. I feel extremely anxious on a daily basis. Like I can't even count the number of hours of sleep that I've lost thinking about this stuff. Like it's not healthy. And I try to, you know, clear my mind. I'm trying to get better at meditating, but like it's physically and mentally harmful to sort of go to sleep angry and go to sleep with all this animosity. And there are so many people that don't have an outlet for it. They don't have a Willie and a Price. They don't have white friends. They don't have a white mother like me that I can talk to about this stuff and know that within my support network, that there are other people on the other side, in this case, the white side of America, that are trying to bridge this gap. So that's why we want to have these conversations, because regardless of whether you think your family benefited from privilege in an individual situation, or whether you think a black person is being too hostile, or, you know, like they're overreacting, or they're misconstruing your words, it doesn't matter. Understand where they're coming from. Understand the fact that they are probably feeling really hurt or really scared or really upset, not about you, but about the entire racial climate. And that's where that quote unquote reverse racism might be coming from. But like, think about it, man. What happens to bullies, or to the kids who get bullied? They go and they do Columbine. Like, not all of them, but like that happens. And that was a result of neglect and, you know, just violence and all this situation that could have been avoided with more understanding and intervention and awareness and all this other stuff. And it doesn't matter if you blame it on the fact that it came from the bullies first, or if it was a moral deficiency of the people who ended up doing the shooting, if it was a mental disability, whatever it was, like, there's no point, because both sides could have done something to remedy it. And both sides are not going to be able to have those conversations and contribute to the remedy if they keep being defensive. So when someone accuses you of white privilege, if you feel like it wasn't an issue of privilege, just let it go. Just let it go, because there is white privilege. Whether or not this incident was tied to that or not, like whether the specific accomplishment, your Rhodes Scholarship, whatever it was tied to the fact that you were white, it doesn't matter. You have to be able to understand why the other side would be like, there's people that didn't get a chance to be where you are because of their skin color. Black people understand that when you're calling out white privilege all the time, even though it still needs to be accepted by a large portion of America, there are certain people that are feeling defensive about it. And maybe you rephrase it and you're like, look, I know you're a good person. I know that you work hard. I know that you had to compete against other people and this wasn't all just handed to you. But think about the people who didn't even have a shot. Put it that way, instead of just being like, you're a silver spoon, white privileged little prick. So think about the language that you use. Think about the emotions that the other person is going to be feeling. Because when you think about it in that sense, it almost is like white privilege and racism doesn't matter. They're just circumstances for the conversation. It's the table setting, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you go
first, Bryce. You go first.
Right. I mean, the part of that, you know, that I think is important is again, the content from the individual. So we've got white friends. We've got white friends we're really close to, you know, and who have accomplished some really cool stuff. And it's not about me looking at them and saying like, damn, you only went to college because you're white, or me saying you only went to college, them saying to me, you only went to college because you're black. But it's about the recognition of, you know, a little bit about the history and the lineage of how that works. It's not about you, but it's about the setup of how you got to be you and got to be where you are, from your parents to your grandparents. You know, it's not, the thing of it that trips me out is that it's not that long ago, right? Like our grandparents, you know, my grandparents who were born in the 20s or the 30s or whatever, right? In heavily segregated America, my parents had an interracial relationship in the early 70s when that was still like not cool, right? At all. You know, it's not like we're like, man, thousands of years ago, right? You know, we're not talking about shit that's like way out of the scope of affecting our lives or even affecting people we can talk to, you know? And even in my work, I've met a woman who's a granddaughter of someone who was a slave, like actually like has those stories, you know? So this shit, you know, this isn't meant to be like, you know, just three dudes like, let me give you this history lesson and tell you why you should feel bad about being white. It's like, you got to understand that it could be as something as simple as 2 generations ago, right? The difference between your grandma and mine and how they were treated in society and how that manifests itself and how she was able to raise her kids, my parents, and how your parents were able to be raised, you know, and what comes of all that. This is not me attacking you and saying, you know, it is not me blaming you for your situation, right? It's not that at all. And it's not an indictment of me being even jealous or angry or saying you owe me because your setup was better than mine. But it's almost a call of recognition to be like, look, man, I'm proud of you. I am, right? But you have to understand as you move forward and be aware of how this shit works and be aware of the differences in the structure, you know? And that's what's important to me about this. You know, it's important to challenge the system and to challenge the structure and have understanding on both sides about how it actually works. And for, you know, white people to have a little bit higher threshold to challenge, you know, some of these racial views and some of the stuff that goes on, to challenge your own views, you know, to be able to look at it, not to devalue your accomplishments, but to be like, oh, well, shit, yeah, I did go to private school. Like, that's probably fucking helpful, you know? Or like, yeah, I had both parents who like read me stories and taught me, you know, French. Like, yeah, you know who doesn't have that? Like a lot of kids in the hood who are like shooting basketball with no shoes on until dark. They don't have this structure. It's not even about like money. I almost said money, clothes, cars, and hoes. That's not where we're going with this. But, you know, it's not about that. It's not about stuff we can touch. You know, it's not about like, ooh, didn't have a nice house, so I didn't go to college. No, but it's about simple things. You had structure, right? You had food. You had, you know, people teaching you right from wrong. You know, you had, you know, all the intangible things, right, that go into that. That's not an exclusively white thing. But, you know, when we talk about this and we talk about, you know, how you've been enculturated and how society reproduces and reinforms, you know, stereotypes and views, and we could talk ad nauseum about media and real estate and all these kind of things, just how that whole system's built. You have to understand that, you know, the products of that, you know, matter based on, you know, the group that you are a member of.
And so I think the big thing that you guys hit on, especially you, I think Price said in the beginning, Price, you just said in your second piece there, is being able to separate your emotions during this type of conversation, because it is an uncomfortable conversation. And time and I can relate to you when you're speaking with a non-Black person and they started asking you questions about, you know, race, and you're just like, why don't you understand? And like, I mean, I think I hit Price up. I actually had a conversation like this recently. And when I was going through it, I was just like, I know there's so many words I want to be able to get out, but as the conversation was going, like I could feel myself getting angry, right? It is just a lot of this anger. So it's just like, you know what? Stop having a conversation. I can come back and address it later. But if I start going down this path, it'll just turn into bitterness, right? And so I think that's the hardest part. And again, it happens on both sides. Can you separate your emotions when trying to have a discussion like this, even though it is a highly charged emotional topic? One of the things that I think really stands out is, you know, Precious started to bring up, you know, how, you know, we were raised. I think in order for, you know, in terms of white privilege, I don't think their conversation, you know, for white people, the conversation may not have ever been how it was for us as Black people growing up, where I remember I had to be squeaky clean. Can't get in trouble. I can't do X. And I got to be so much better than everybody else, right? Just because I was a Black male. So that in and of itself.
Do you remember when you got your ears pierced?
You said what?
Do you remember when you got your ears pierced?
Oh, my dad was about to shoot me when I got my ears pierced.
You remember when you got all your tattoos? Come on, we all had those stories, right?
Yeah, you know, like I remember Oh yeah, my dad was super when I got the ears pierced. Like I mean, he didn't even really say anything in terms of, you're young black male, but it's just one of those things where you can just kind of see it's just like, like why, like why, like you already got to do X amount of stuff. I mean, and even still to this day, I don't wear my earrings at work. Right, it's something that I do, something like that I just do. But again, that's a conversation that happens habitually for people, and for black males, you got to be better. You got to stay out of trouble. You can't do this just because you have to climb multiple hurdles to be able to get to the equal playing field, to be able to achieve and be recognized. And so I think that's a different take on white privilege, is that you got that white people don't necessarily have to have that type of conversation in terms of achievement. Their conversation going to be, you go out there, you work hard, you have a good, and you do fantastic, you know what you can achieve. Ours is, you got to be better than everybody else just to get onto the same footing before you can achieve. So it's an extra step in there that, white people may not necessarily have to speak about. In the same token as well, on a different vein, when we start talking about, structure that's brought up into, in quote, more, white homes, that I think now ties into when you start defining racism on an institutional level. And I think that can be a whole other episode in and of itself, and how, people are like, well, it's not our fault that black fathers don't stay around and things like that. And it's like, this is that's a pretty deep rooted issue that goes towards that institutional level of racism. And when you define racism on an institutional level, you'll see the byproduct of that is broken homes, right? You'll start being able to examine those things. But I think for the purpose of us and the purpose of this conversation, I think the main thing is, one, being able to separate your feelings from these discussions, but two, being able to recognize that people come from a place of privilege. And for white people, you come from a place of white privilege where, again, you're not battling 400 years of oppression to get to where you are today, right? And when you look at American history, and it's just, again, don't feel sorry for being white. Be proud of who you are, but you still got to be able to recognize the history of this country and where that leads to where we are today. And is it better than what it was 50 years ago and 100 years ago? Yeah, you can always say that, but is it still fantastic? No, I mean, we're still working on it, and that's why these discussions are happening, and that's why it's good to be able to use social media, hopefully, to be able to spread these type of discussions and open up these type of forums, right? Because while it's still better, it doesn't make it fantastic, right? And it can still look to be improved, and we can still be able to get people on the same footing, and for lack of a better phrase, make America great, right?
Oh my, come the fuck
Willie,
on,
get
man.
out. Get out.
Jesus
I
Christ.
couldn't resist.
You almost vomited that out too.
It's like,
No, I mean, look, hold on, let me amidst that stupidity, you did make a very good point, which I really like, is the simple fact that you guys, not you three, but in having this conversation, you can't get pissy and moany and be like, well, it's not my fault. I didn't set it up. I didn't invent slavery. Like, that's just a stupid fucking thing to say. And it's not like witty, it's not funny, you're just an asshole, right? Because just because you didn't invent it doesn't mean that it doesn't benefit. You look at the three of us. We came from 2 family homes. We have strong parents who taught us right from wrong and all this other kind of shit, right? A lot of people don't have that. So we can't just like go somewhere and be like, and be like, well, it's not my fault your dad went to jail. Yeah, right? We have to understand that we benefit from that, right? We benefited from that, and yeah, we say, yeah, okay, you're right. Like, we got a little bit of a head start, and we had to hustle and work hard for some other shit. We're all proud of where we are and what we've done, and there's more to be done. It doesn't devalue that, but we look at that and say, yeah, yes,
definitely
right?
Definitely got
We got a leg up. We had roofs over our heads, right? We had parents that were around. We didn't have to worry about where our meals were coming from, all that kind of shit. That gives us a head start. And this is just a quick for everybody. If you haven't, I don't care who you are, where you are, white, black, otherwise, read Coates. Read Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. It's a quick read, and it gets back to what you were talking about and when we asked the tattoo question. And he basically makes the point that as a black guy, you have to be twice as good to end up equal, right? And that's exactly what you said, And every parent or at least a lot of parents, have that moment of like, oh, God, this kid's got tattoos, he's got earrings. It was never about you or me. Our parents weren't like, oh, they're lost causes. It's like, I'm worried about how the world will see my child. You know, I'm worried about my kid doing anything stupid. I'm worried about how society will see my son. And that's a real conversation for parents of black males. I almost, well, I don't guarantee it, but I can't imagine a time where a mom's like, wonder if Chris is going to be okay. He's like, no, he's fucking great. Go out there and, go out there and be somebody, right? But there's real moments of our parents had those moments where they were like, I'm worried about how society will view him solely based on how he looks.
So let me ask you this question, because if we want to hammer home the point of the arguing being not efficient and not helpful for anything, because I think we've talked about the definitions, and we've also kind of talked about how the definitions really are not the main thing to focus on. Like, people love to catch black people doing something that, according to the Webster's dictionary definition of racism, is racist, and they're like, aha, according to this contract, you're being racist too, so black people are racist too, so I don't want to hear about white people being racist because black people are racist too. And it's not worth getting in, trying to define racism in that sense. There's clearly an underlying issue that these two sides are not seeing eye to eye on. So let's say, for the hypothetical, and probably a little bit for our target audience here, let's say that you're a white person who gets called out on not checking your privilege. That's a term that you hear, like, people say often, check your privilege. Just basically be aware of it is what that means, and acknowledge it. Let's say you get called out by somebody for not checking your privilege. And let's, for the sake of narrowing the answer, let's say that this is a white person, can be male or female. Let's use William and Mary as an example. Let's use the constant question of, oh, did you only get in because you were black, versus would you have gotten in if you weren't white and upper middle class and coming from a suburb? Like, would you have gotten in either? So let's say that you get accused as a white person of not acknowledging your privilege or downplaying the role that it had in something. How do you respond to that, to somebody, in a way that's not turning around and saying, you're being racist by assuming I wouldn't have gotten here? It becomes an argument of semantics. So what is the actual response for people?
I think when it starts getting to those things like, you wouldn't have gotten in because of X, I think just in the rules of arguing, by flipping it on them and saying, well, you wouldn't have gotten in because of this, then again, it gets to that circular argument that we spoken of, where nothing gets talked about. And it's like, well, no, I mean, you say that, but I did A, B, C, and D, because every black person I met that was at William and Mary had accomplishments. There wasn't a black person rolling in with a 2.5 that got into William and Mary. I mean, everybody was highly educated. I mean, I was top 10% of my class. I'm sure you guys were very high up within your class too. We all had extracurriculars, sports, what have you. So by saying that, oh, you only got in because you're black, it's like, no, I got in because I accomplished a lot. I did work. It wasn't just a hand me down. It wasn't just a give me that was there.
But you're defending yourself right now.
But I would say that's part. Oh shit! Sorry.
Yeah, no, but
I was gonna say the same thing though. That I was gonna let you finish, but now I'm not. I was gonna say the same thing.
This whole time, like, if I'm a white guy in that situation, I'm like, the stats don't lie. They show that the average black person at William & Mary, for example, has a lower GPA than the average white person. Like, the incoming SAT scores are disparate. So here you're defending your accomplishments. You're not telling me right now that the actual best people, most qualified people, are getting in. You're telling me you have accomplishments. Like, great, you get up and put your pants on every day. You want a cookie? Great, congratulations, you get into William & Mary. They're going to be like, I don't want to hear it because my friend from Thomas Jefferson got a 1600 on the SAT, plays the violin, is captain of the debate team, and didn't get into William & Mary. And you came from an urban school where you got a 1320 and you had a 3.0 GPA, and you're at William & Mary and you're doing worse. How can you say that you're not taking someone's spot? How can you say that? And I mean, and what I was saying, like being defensive is like, you can rattle off all your accomplishments, but that's not the point of the conversation. The point is that the person, as I see it, and I don't want to answer my own question, but like, as I see it, that person is not understanding the bigger picture, which is this school is committed to diversity for a reason. If you brought everyone from the same area, it's not gonna lead to learning and exposure for your kids in college. B, they're being oblivious to what a major role systemic racism played in the education gap, in the income gap, and all these things that allowed that Thomas Jefferson student 600. So what I would do, we can pose the question the other way. What do you, and Price can answer that one. What do you do if a white person accuses you of being reverse racist, let's say for Price? But if someone, if someone came at me and then they ended up coming back with like, oh, well, you took up somebody else's spot, for example, I'd be like, look, we need to go and look at the facts on how race means that the absolute scores and the measurements for academic success are not going to be just an absolute scale. They're going to be relative to your circumstances. That's the real issue. And so if it goes in defending yourself back and forth in terms of what you did versus what somebody else did and who deserves it more, you're kind of getting away from the main point is what I was.
You're trying to make the main point on the system and how that shapes what the person is.
Because if they knew where I came from, like I came from Queens, like I came from a classrooms that were 30 to 35 kids per, there were no textbooks, there were no tutors, there were no after school programs. Our outdoor area was a concrete parking lot. There was no basketball, there was no football team. I didn't even know that kids played sports in school because I didn't know the schools had them. Like these are things that prevented me from necessarily achieving on the same level as someone. But if I start complaining about it, they're going to be like, same old sad song. But if I start saying like, I hope you take a minute to understand how much of a disadvantage it is to come from certain communities, then you're actually approaching the real issue here, which is acknowledging the problem.
Yeah, I mean, the simple fact is there's an unequal distribution of resources, power, and opportunity, right? That exists. Period. If you want to argue me on that, you're stupid. That's all I have to say about that, right? So based on that and using that as a foundation, that's a good place to start with that. Just lead with that, and I think Willie was an interesting example, right? Because you feathered right into like the, here's what I did, right? And your resume is impressive, but that's going to be the crux of it, is that there has to be some sort of relativity to this, right? And you have to look at the fact like that you have these kids who are in schools who are being shaped and molded by their environment as kids are, right? And so you look at, you can even look in towns that are, relatively liberal. Charlottesville, for example, you look at the private school system and even the public schools in Charlottesville, there's some kids who you would look at and say, these kids aren't given a fair shot. Or, up in DC and some of these 40 schools in Anacostia, you got 27 kids, you have sort of an aide, right? But all these kids come from families where they're being raised by their older sisters who also has a kid, right? And you're saying, wow, and if you're looking at the kid in 18, you're like, holy fuck, this kid's got decent grades, and has decent or good SAT scores, not great, but good. He's not a fucking genius, right? Do they deserve access to the opportunity to achieve? And that's where, and that's, I think, a point where a lot of people can get on board with that, can get on board with, they have a little bit of an understanding of, look, the distribution of these things is inequitable from the jump, right? So the simple fact that will manifest itself in a little bit of variation in absolute value statistics to allow people the same opportunity is not only okay, it's absolutely fucking necessary.
No, again, I think it's one of the ones where it's very easy for us to have the conversation on an individual level, but can we broaden the conversation to a more overall level in terms of the discussion of race? If you keep it at an individual level, right, then it makes it difficult to be able to expand our thinking, because then when people are thinking about it, it's just like, oh, okay, well, my one black friend that I know said that, he did all this, so cool, right? I think it does start off on the individual level, but I think we have to be able to have that conversation on a bigger scale and really bring in that piece. I think, something that we'll talk about down the road would be institutional racism. And I think that plays a bigger factor. And I think that ties in to how white privilege is formed and how, Black people have to necessarily behave, but how we act within society based off of that type of systemic racism. And I think that would be a very interesting topic. But again, I think the biggest draw or takeaway that we're trying to have is, one, separate your feelings from these type of discussions, and two, be able to recognize that everybody comes from a place of privilege. This just happens to be white privilege that we're speaking about, and to be able to recognize that, yes, whether you feel that you did anything, you shouldn't feel guilty about it, but you should still recognize that being a white person in America does warrant certain advantages, right? And I think that's the main bottom line right there.
So final thoughts. I go first. We've talked about this a lot. All of these episodes are basically trying to get people to understand how difficult these conversations are to have, and in general, how difficult human emotion is to navigate. Like, we are not good at it. It's almost impossible to be really good at communicating how you're feeling all the time in a way that other people are going to understand it. So there's so much frustration around privilege, and we talked about that earlier. It's like it's hard to not take it as an attack on your pride and your accomplishments, and there is a sort of natural reaction. Like, I won't necessarily go as far as to say it's like Newtonian, but there's always a reaction to an initial act, right? And if you try to understand it in the sense of these comments that people are making are not happening in a vacuum. It's not just one line of text that then goes and applies to your whole life. You have to think about the fact that they were addressing a certain instance from their position, which might be anger or fear or frustration or emotional distress in some way. And at the end of the day, if you understand where someone's coming from, not only like with their circumstances, but also their emotions, you'll actually have a better understanding of what they're saying. And so for white privilege and reverse racism, what you're saying when you say someone is privileged and they come back and be like, you're being reverse racist, the white person is there saying to you, like, I think you're downplaying the fact that I care and the fact that I, have worked really hard. And the Black person there is saying, I think you're still not showing the level of compassion and awareness of your privilege. And regardless of whether you want to agree or disagree with the level of compassion that you have, perception is reality in a sense. And if people are telling you that they don't feel that compassion from you, then have more compassion. If you have the ability, it doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong. It's about when someone comes to you upset and distressed, you don't tell them how to feel. You don't, tell them that they shouldn't feel a certain way or that they don't have a reason to be upset at you. You just hear them out. You try and show a little bit of compassion. And Black people, it's hard for white people to understand if they've never been to our neighborhoods, if they've never been to the public schools, if they've never had these kind of conversations. So they're going to downplay it. And it's important to have patience and to remember that it's going to be a long time before we chip away at racism to the point where it doesn't exist. And the more patient and tactful you can be in the communication, aka not just hurling around white privilege all the time, trying to get them to step to that like gradually, it'll be a more constructive conversation. So again, we always tie it back to empathy, engage, educate, empathize, right? Like, if you can do that, Price coined that, give him credit. If you can do that, this conversation will be a lot easier to have, and you won't have to hang your argument on terms like reverse racism or white privilege.
Yeah, that sums up a lot of it. I mean, I think that it comes down to being able to really hit it, separate the content from the emotion, and then Diamond piggybacked it, which is really hard to do, right? So we're basically asking you to do something that we know is inherently extraordinary, right? And it's hard to do for anyone. And it's hard in that moment when someone's saying, yo, man, look, I know you only got here, because you're Black. It's impossible not to be like, yeah, well, okay, fine. You want to try that again? dickhead, right? But it's not productive, right? And so there's an element of productivity and understanding and breaking down that level of naivety, that exists. This whole white fragility argument, I would argue that it exists, and I would argue that it's rampant, and that's not saying all white people are like racist and stupid, but it's an element of having a very low appetite for racial views that are presented as attacks on the individual. And that's why I think it's important for minorities to be very clear in situations that call for it. If someone does some racist shit to you, then you need to handle your business. But to be very clear and having these conversations within your trusted circle, that it's about the system, right? And it's about the foundations and how it's built. It's not a direct attack on you. It's not an attack on this perceived meritocracy, right? Because we all think America is based on the best achieve, right? The best get the best. And everyone starts at level 1, and if you're better, you rise, right? Well, I would argue that that's not true, but claiming that there is white privilege sort of offends this notion of meritocracy. It offends this notion of objectivity, and a lot of people take offense to that. And folks, like, we listened to this. I've showed you guys this idiot Autry Pruitt, this guy today, who's like, well, if you're black, start a business, start a real estate company, and I'm just like, and so even thinking like that, and again, this proves it's not exclusive to white people, but not understanding even privilege as the nugget of that is something that people don't get. People don't understand that we didn't all start on flat ground. We didn't all start on the same level. We didn't all just, come out and like, okay, you guys are all have access to the same shit, and whatever you do with it is up to you, right? That's not how this works. So the first step, educate, empathize, engage, and really try hard. That's what I would implore you guys to do for the next couple weeks is try really hard, if and when these things come up, to think, have a think about what's the content of this argument. They're not attacking my achievements, but they're bringing to light the system that exists that allowed me a leg up. I have to be hip to that. I'm still proud of what I've done, and I'm still personally proud of what I've done, but I understand that I was given advantages that a lot of people didn't have access to. That allowed me to get to where I am, right? Doesn't devalue that, but I'm not going to lie and be like, oh yeah, I started in the slums and I couldn't even read till I was 13, and look at me now. It's not about that, So understand the landscape, find people you trust, have these conversations. Maybe it's us. I don't know. Read Coates. If you need a copy, hit me up. I've got one. It's great. I'm out.
Again, just to kind of wrap up, then everything that you guys said, I feel is definitely is very important, and I think the thing that you brought up, Price, in terms of meritocracy, I think is extremely important, because I think when people look at it and they're like, well, racial didn't matter, it's just about the work that you put in, and they like to point out rags to riches stories of X minority or X celebrity. Even those that have been in that situation where they have thrived will definitely say that there's a stroke of luck that happened that was involved, right? But the biggest thing is that not everybody starts off on the same level. There's always going to be a level of privilege that's going to be attached for somebody, right? And so when you're looking at this white privilege, again, the biggest thing is to be able to recognize that it does exist. It's the same thing when we talk about racism. Recognize that it does exist. Just because it doesn't exist in the real world doesn't mean that it's not out there. It's not rampant. It's not visible, right? So recognize that it does exist. First you recognize, and then the second thing you got to be able to do is, all right, well, that it is accepted. You accept it. It's there. How can I start having these conversations and be open about it, and realize that there is privilege, there is racism? How can I be a better person in this cog of the world to help mitigate or be a mediator in the racist spectrum, right? How can I help get this conversation moving forward? And so I think as soon as you get to that point of being able to recognize that it's there, the next step is to be a little bit more active, and that's where we get into that engaging piece, right? So you kind of educate yourself about it, then you start to be able to engage, and then during that engagement piece, can we empathize, right? Can we start looking to be able to relate to people across, quote, the other side of the road? Can we begin to have these type of conversations and separate our emotions from it, and be able to try to understand, or not necessarily even have to understand, just listen, right? Just try to learn, and then that way we can start moving forward with these type of conversations, and again continue to grow the conversation and spread it, and then that's how we build bridges versus burning everything down and becoming a more segregated society. So, with that being said, we'll get all this one up for everybody who wasn't able to check in live. I just want to give a shout out to my boys in the back. Just in case you guys didn't know, we're sitting in first place, top of the table.
I actually thought there were people behind you for a second, because no way you would say something that stupid on this show.
Nope, just did. Says the guy that took off his shirt at the end of the show. That's good.
Hey, that was part of increasing our fandom.
Okay.
Didn't work. White people still ain't listening to you. Turn back on LL Cool J.
All right, well, with that, we'll see y'all in a couple weeks. We'll hit our next topic. Damn it, Price.
God.